You're listening to Foster Your Health Radio.
Welcome to the first episode of Foster Your Health. My name is Dave Foster. I'm your host. This is, like I said, the initial opening to what I hope to be a long series of podcasts dealing with health issues in nutrition, science, biology, politics, philosophy. But I hope that I can tie it back and offer some tangible value and hopefully insight into various ways to improve your health, dietary, supplemental, biohacks, anything therein. So let's get started. The first episode, I would like to talk about hyperthyroidism and depression. My work is largely based from Dr. Raymond Peat, who has done extensive research over 50 years into the thyroid and hormonal profiles of humans, especially women, and how that relates to mood. As I struggle with mood, as I think we all do, I would like to share some of my experiences with thyroid supplementation and pulse and temperature. For those of you who don't really understand what pulse and temperature means or why it's significant, pulse and temperature serves as a good proxy for good thyroid function. So if you're hypothyroid, you will compensate with elevated adrenaline, which will elevate your pulse above what it normally would be, and it will depress your temperature. And due to the biological nature of cortisol and adrenaline will drop your temperature while elevating your pulse, and that will give you the illusion of hyperthyroidism if you only went by pulse. By the opposite stance, cortisol will elevate your body temperature, and it will tend to lower your pulse and lower adrenaline. And the way adrenaline is released in the body is when a period of low blood sugar happens and you go too long without eating, adrenaline kicks in to try to elevate your blood glucose. And from there, it signals ACTH to produce cortisol, and serotonin's involved in this as well. Then when cortisol comes in, it lowers the initial adrenaline response and elevates serum glucose. That allows your pulse to drop down and your temperature to go up. If you start to yawn a lot throughout the day, that'll usually follow a period of anxiety or apathy or lack of motivation. That is serotonin causing that excitatory role of anxiety, apathy, depression, aggression, as Dr. Peat talks about on his article about serotonin, aggression, and depression. And from there, you go from that period of excitement to depression and lethargy, and you start to yawn, and that's the cortisol kicking in. So, to summarize again, adrenaline leads to an elevated pulse, cortisol leads to an elevated body temperature. It's difficult to have both. I wouldn't say impossible, but remarkably rare due to the biological mechanisms to have both elevated cortisol and adrenaline at the same time. And so, a good proxy to see, do I have good thyroid function, is to take your temperature and your pulse, and if your temperature is above 98.6 and your pulse is above 75, ideally it would be 80 to 90, then you can say, I have good thyroid function. I like to take my temperature under my arm. It's called the auxiliary method of taking your temperature. Leaving it there from anywhere from 2 to 10 minutes before you take your temperature will allow the thermometer to acclimate, and you'll get a more accurate reading that way. There is a common misconception, especially in alternative health communities, that it's given that hypothyroidism or an underperforming thyroid leads to depression and leads to anxiety and leads to symptoms of low mood and tiredness. And it's well known that hypothyroidism and depression go hand in hand. But by the same token, it's often forgotten or it's excused in one way or another that hyperthyroidism also causes depression and anxiety. It's often excused based on the idea that a higher metabolism is better, therefore you want to go as high as you can go without getting into a lethal range. That's not the case at all. A lot of this has to do with counter-regulatory mechanisms in the body that elevate stress hormones. As an example of this, whenever you go hyperthyroid, and this is for androgens, so this is your testosterone, when you go hyperthyroid, your testosterone level goes up. It's well known that people with good thyroid function, they're hyperthyroid, have elevated testosterone, they have good gains in the gym, and they tend to be stronger. But that would be the case if not for another mechanism where sex hormone binding globulin is elevated by hyperthyroidism that binds to your sex hormones, and it binds to both testosterone and estrogen, and it binds more strongly to estrogen. And so even though you're hyperthyroid and even though your testosterone level can be very high, your estrogen level will also be very high, and you'll probably get greater predominance of estrogenic symptoms because sex hormone binding globulin, that SHBG, is binding more strongly to testosterone and increasing the estrogen-testosterone ratio in favor of estrogen. So you functionally have more estrogen. And so you can get symptoms like sensitive nipples. And I've personally gotten symptoms like that for going into temporary periods of hyperthyroidism. People who drink coffee often report that they get sensitive breasts and sensitive chests. They get that nipple sensitivity, and that's because often either you're sending your blood glucose too low by not being well fed before you consume coffee or caffeine, or you're pushing your body into a temporary hyperthyroid range, and that's causing your body to upregulate that SHBG, which is going to decrease the testosterone to estrogen ratio and increase the predominance of estrogen. And so, back on topic, that's just one example of how hyperthyroidism really does negatively impact an individual health, because it is a bell curve of beneficial effects. And you really want to aim for that euthyroid range. You don't want to go too far into hyperthyroidism. Transient hyperthyroidism, that's hyperthyroidism for a short period of time, can have some benefits, especially if you're trying to recover from a degenerative condition like fibromyalgia, which I personally have recovered from successfully. I've had it, and as long as I keep my temperature and pulse up, I have no pain, zero across the whole day. It's remarkable. I'm impressed with myself that I could actually do that, and it's only with implementations of lessons I've learned across the years, particularly teachings of Ray Peat on energy metabolism, and Danny Roddy as well on how fibromyalgia is characterized by low energy metabolism. Relating that to other degenerative conditions, you can think of depression and mental illness as the first sign that something is going wrong in the body. The nervous system is so sensitive to the integrity of the biological organism that when something in the human body is wrong, the first thing to know is your mind. If you're depressed or if you're anxious, that is a reliable way to know either something in your body is going wrong, but also that something in your environment needs to be changed. And that's really what that signal is implying. Some interaction between the organism and its environment is not going well. So you should address that problem, whatever it is, whether it's light deprivation or social isolation or a poor diet or an inflamed gut. Speaking of which, I have to go eat a carrot salad in a little bit. That's a great way to sterilize your gut and to keep the bacteria colonies happy, producing as few of the toxic metabolic byproducts of bacteria as possible. I'll do another video on how to make the carrot salad and why it's good. Back to mood, the gut plays a primary role. To go back to hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism, the euthyroid range that you want to shoot for, your temperature should be above 98.6 after eating. You want your pulse to not exceed, it varies among individuals, but in my experience, I have a very narrow window of what my pulse can do and before things go very badly. So I feel really good around a pulse of 85, which is what Dr. Pete recommends as an average. I feel good around that range, but I never feel ideal or not quite euphoric, but metabolically sound, a feeling of well-being, a feeling of peace, similar to long sessions of meditation, and I get that when I get my pulse around 90 to 91. Now, interestingly, as every time I've measured my pulse and it's been 92 or higher, my mood has been horrible, and if it goes into 94, 95, 96 up, my mood gets to the point where I can't focus, I get depressed, terrible anxiety symptoms sometimes, but more so if you chronically elevate your pulse into this hyperthyroid range, you start to get horrible mood effects and feelings of discontentment, inability to focus is incredibly huge, and there seems to be periods of oscillating depression and hypersexuality when you go to that hyperthyroid range. It's usually fine if you don't eat, and what you'll find is there'll be a period after you eat when you're hyperthyroid that your pulse will drop, and it won't drop into a hypothyroid range, but it will drop into a euthyroid range, thereby combating that hyperthyroidism that you've imposed upon yourself. And this often happens in people who are very slightly hyperthyroid. In the evening, their pulse will drop ever so slightly, and I've found this with myself. My pulse will be 98, 96, 95 throughout the day if I'm hyperthyroid, Into the evening, it'll drop to 91, 90, 89, 88, and I'll feel great in the evening and I'll sleep really well, but I feel terrible during the day, and that's a good sign to show you what your ideal pulse range is to keep track of your mood. There are other things that go into your mood besides your thyroid function, but if anything's going to kill your mood, it's definitely hypo or hyperthyroidism. Until you address either one of those conditions, it's very difficult to properly gauge what your environment is doing to you and what direction you should go in. To add to that, when I find I'm hyperthyroid, my motivation is there sometimes. It's transient. At the same time, purpose and big picture clarity, feelings of direction, very foggy. There seems to be something with learned helplessness, which Dr. Pete talks about in his articles, and which is caused largely by serotonin excess. I find I have those symptoms when I'm hyperthyroid and hypothyroid, possibly worse when I'm hyperthyroid. One must be very careful if you're introduced to certain ideas on the internet or other sources of my thyroid will dictate my happiness, and the higher my pulse is, the higher my temperature is, the more happy I will be. That is not the case. There is a therapeutic window for pulse and temperature, and once you exceed that, your symptoms will worsen, your mood will worsen, and mortality will probably increase as well, and your life expectancy is going down after a certain point. Be careful to monitor your temperature and your pulse and make sure that your temperature doesn't go too high. I find when I get into the 99.4 or above temperature range, I start to feel uneasy, I start to feel anxious. I also feel that when I go into the pulse range above 91, I feel the same. Keep an eye on your blood pressure as well, because your blood pressure can have terrible implications in your mood. What I found is that a higher blood pressure, pre-hypertensive or hypertensive, and I'm just going by systolic. Obviously, the diastolic's important too, but when I find my systolic is over 130, I feel somewhat helpless. When it gets hypertensive, I feel incredibly depressed. If I ever hit 140 or 135, I feel remarkably unmotivated to do anything. This doesn't mean that solving a high blood pressure or hypertensive problem and still maintaining a high pulse, so if your blood pressure is 115 over 68, which mine often is, and my pulse is 103, that doesn't mean that I'll feel good. Definitely something to keep in mind, that having a high blood pressure can worsen the negative implications of hyperthyroidism with regard to mood. What I want you to take away from this is, do not think that measuring these markers are going to imply a perfect state. Largely in determining what is a perfect state, how do I be happy, feelings of bliss and euphoria, I find that the most important things, and Dr. Pete has commented on this as well, is a clean intestine. If you're after bliss, you would ideally avoid starch completely, depending on your digestion. Some can tolerate starch fine, and some can tolerate a little starch, and some can tolerate a lot. I hope to go into those topics in further detail as the show progresses in future episodes, but for this one, that's it for the show.
Can't get enough of Foster Your Health? Follow us on Twitter at @real_Dave Foster and join the healthcare revolution at fosteryourhealth.com. While you're there, be sure to check out our new merch. Thanks for listening. Have a healthy day.